Oh, Ote. It's the 8th of October. This and that. Let me introduce where I'm going to go from now, sort of. And I haven't been getting enough writing done, so I've got to figure out ways to expedite that. One way to do it is to, uh, and I suspect that people are not quite so profoundly interested in the minutia and technical literature that I happen to be obsessed with. The theories of the rentier and well, after Thursday, when there's a Michael Hudson, the author himself is going to appear for the Class Unity folks. That certainly will be a phase to end. So, and I think generally audience-wise for our little group here um, is I have other interests and other stories to tell, and I'm certainly happy to do some of them. And short of doing a session on Ask Me Anything, which as I get older, it doesn't, things don't matter quite as much. So I may do that at some time, at some point also, but not perhaps on YouTube. Um, there's a trilogy of books done by the comparative literature scholar David Lodge uh, of late, and he wrote a trilogy of books that I came first upon when, yes, I'll name drop. I was researching at the British Library, and I actually ran into a colleague of mine from UCLA. And there's another story there, but I won't get into that unless I need to. Um, a very nice guy from England. I can't remember where he did his. I think he did his PhD at London, at University of London. And anyway, and the author of a book on how to read down a luck, and or at least he organized it in English. Anyway, yeah, and he was having lunch with I'll do more name dropping. A feminist scholar who wrote one of the early books on semiotic analysis of British advertising. Anyway, so an interesting group to have coffee with out a block away from the British Museum. So anyway, he turned me on to this trilogy. Well, at that time, it wasn't quite a trilogy, I guess. The first book in the trilogy is called Changing Places by David Lodge. Second book is called Small World. And the third book is Nice Work, as in the expression nice work if you can fiddle it in the British context. And so it's a nice little series, and it is sort of, disguises the roles of actual people. The person, I think Morris Zapp in the first book is actually the scholar Stanley Fish, who brought um, uh, Frederick Jameson to Duke. So making, a part of this whole business about making sort of Duke a center for certain types of critical literary analysis, among other things. So that's kind of part of the front end of this. And when the first book was written, or the second book was written, I think I had actually come in contact with a bunch of people from the Modern Language Association, and because I'd been working on critical theory, and so I just one of the things I was doing. Anyway, so the first book, and so what I'm going to do is probably read from a book. I have a copy of the middle book, and which I've already uploaded into files. So I hope that you'll take a look at it. I will probably upload a copy of the first book, which maybe we'll do that. Perhaps we'll do that on tomorrow. We'll just see. I'm just going to start reading the introductions, and then we'll start into the book itself, and then I'll stop. So this is for Changing Places, the first campus novel by David Lodge. The subtitle is A Tale of Two Campuses, and thus a literary allusion to Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. First novel in a trilogy, followed by Small World, 1984, and Nice Work, 1988. Um, and yes, in the 1980s, I probably was more interested in this kind of literature, partially because I sort of had enough of it, I suppose, or I had too much of it. And you occasionally hear my cynicism about it. But if you're an undergraduate and you sort of see, how shall we say it, incestuous the social environment of academia is, you sort of either get really sort of inured to it or perhaps more cynical about it. And sometimes we don't learn from those lessons. And part of my interest in this was to learn from this lesson. I had made a dear mistake in the early 80s along those lines, and I tried to change that. But by the time I got to the 90s, still hadn't really changed, although well, it was a little better, but not much. Needless to say, it's an important thing in my life, and not important to me so much as sort of it signifies a certain moments of change. The plate glass concrete jungle of Euphoria State University, aka actually Berkeley, and the damp red brick University of Rummage, aka Birmingham, University of Birmingham, have an annual exchange scheme. Normally, the exchange passes without comment. But when Philip Swallow swaps with Professor Zapp, the fates play a hand, and the two academics find themselves enmeshed in a spiraling involvement on opposite sides of the Atlantic. Nobody is immune. Students, colleagues, even wives are swapped as the tension increases. Finally, the cat is let out of the bag with a flourish that surprises even the author himself. And it's just an interesting little story there. I've included some other things. The plot summary for Nice Work, which is book number 3 in the series, summarized in 4 minutes. As you may remember, those of you actually, are moderately interested in what I throw out here. There's 4 episodes of the BBC Two 1989 television version of Nice Work, and I don't. Well, it might actually be better than the book, so one would see, but I'm not going to show it. I have shown a couple of episodes of it to. Not everyone was that interested in it at the time. Perhaps people will be more interested now. Needless to say, if something as sort of tedious as an academic novel series gets onto the BBC, that perhaps advances its own cultural worth. Small World, this is the middle novel, follows the lives of a group of academics and their personal and professional relationships as they travel to various conferences and symposia around the world. The main character is Percy McGarrigle, a young Irish poet who's trying to make a name for himself in the world of academia. At the start of the novel, Percy is attending a conference in Rummage, a fictional town in the Midlands of England, where he meets a number of other scholars, including the beautiful Philomena Guiney, a literary critic and feminist, and Morris Zapp, a American literary theorist. Perce becomes infatuated with Philomena and begins pursuing her, but she's not interested in him romantically. As the novel progresses, the various characters travel to different parts of the world for conferences and other academic events. Perce goes to a conference in California where he meets Zapp's wife, Angelica, who's also a literary critic. Perce and Angelica begin a brief affair, which Philomena discovers when she arrives in California for another conference. Meanwhile, Zapp becomes embroiled in a plagiarism scandal, which causes his academic career to spiral out of control. Perce's own career also suffers in the United Kingdom. Despite these setbacks, Perce persists in his pursuit of Philomena and eventually wins her over. The two of them get married and move to Ireland, where Perce takes a teaching job and begins working on his poetry. Throughout the novel, Lodge uses the theme of the small world of academia to explore the interconnectedness of the various characters and their relationships. The novel is a satire of the academic world, poking fun at the petty rivalries and ego-driven behavior of the scholars who populate it. Despite its satirical tone, Small World is ultimately a poignant portrayal of the human need for connection and love. So that's the the synopsis, I suppose, of the current one, which I will now begin reading, noting that remember there are three of them. Changing Places is number one, Small World is number two, and Nice Work is number three, and written, over a decade, and an indulgence, I suppose. By the time he gets to the fourth, there is a fourth one, and yes, not unlike the theories of surplus value, there is a fourth one which actually uses some of the same characters, and they're in Hawaii for some reason. And at some moment, Lodge, not unlike a couple of people in his book, makes enough money so that he can afford to not be a professor anymore, which is also part of the book number 4, and sort of the life of the future, as it were. All right. And with that little aside, let's see if I can get this thing rolling. Damn it, Paul. Here we go. Okay, Small World. Like Changing Places, Book 1, to which is a kind of sequel, Small World resembles what this is the author's note, sometimes called the real world, without corresponding exactly to it, and is peopled by figments of the imagination. Rummage is not Birmingham, although it owes something to popular prejudices about that city. And there really is an underground chapel at Heathrow and a James Joyce pub in Zurich, but no universities in Limerick or Darlington, nor, as far as I know, was there ever a British Council representative resident in Genoa. The MLA Convention of 1979 did not take place in New York, although I have drawn on the program for the 1978 one, which did, and so on. And he acknowledges the special thanks for information received, not to mention many other favors are due to Donald and Margot Fanger and Susumu Tagaki. Most of the books from which I have derived hints, ideas, and inspirations for this one are mentioned in the text, but I should acknowledge a debt to two which are not. Inescapable Romance, Studies in the Poetics of a Mode by Patricia A. Parker, Princeton University Press, 1979, and Airport International by Brian Moynihan of Pan Books. So that's the author's note. Part 1. April is the cruelest month, Percy McGarrigle quoted silently to himself, gazing through grimy window panes at the unseasonable snow crusting the lawns and flower beds of the Rummage campus. He had recently completed a master's dissertation on the poetry of T.S. Eliot, but the opening words of The Wasteland might, with equal probability, have been passing through the heads of any one of the 50-odd men and women of varying ages who sat or slumped in the raked rows of seats in the same lecture room. For they were all well acquainted with that poem, being university teachers of English language and literature gathered together here in the English Midlands for their annual conference, and few of them were enjoying themselves. Dismay had been already plainly written on many faces when they assembled the previous evening for the traditional sherry reception. The conferees had by that time acquainted themselves with the accommodation provided in one of the university's halls of residence, a building hastily erected in 1969 at the height of the boom in higher education, and now only 10 years later, looking much the worse for wear. They had glumly unpacked their suitcases in study bedrooms whose cracked and pitted walls retained in a pattern of rectangular fade marks the traces of posters hurriedly removed, sometimes with portions of plaster adhering to them by their youthful owners at the commencement of the Easter vacation. They had appraised the stained and broken furniture, explored the dusty interiors of cupboards in vain for coat hangers, cupboards or closets, and tested the narrow beds whose springs sagged dejectedly in the middle, deprived of all resilience by the battering of a decade's horseplay and copulation. Each room had a wash basin. Oops. Though not every wash basin had a plug, or every plug a chip. Some taps could not be turned on, and some could not be turned off. For more elaborate ablutions, or to answer a call of nature, it was necessary to venture out into the drafty and labyrinthine labyrinthine corridors, or themed corridors, in search of one of the communal washrooms where baths, showers, and toilets were to be found, but little privacy and unreliable supplies of hot water. To veterans of conferences held in British provincial universities, these were familiar discomforts, and up to a point stoically accepted, as was the rather inferior sherry served at the reception, a little-known brand that seemed to protest too much its Spanish origins by the lurid depiction of a bullfight and a flamenco dancer on the label. As was the dinner which awaited them afterwards: tomato soup, roast beef, and 2 vegetables, jam tart with custard, from every item from which all traces of flavor had been conscientiously removed by prolonged cooking at high temperatures. More than customary aggravation was generated by the discovery that the conference would be sleeping in one building, eating in another, and meeting for lectures and discussions on the main campus, thus ensuring for all concerned a great deal of tiresome walking to and fro on paths and pavements made dangerous and unpleasant by the snow. But the real source of depression, as the conferees gathered for the sherry and squinted at the little white cardboard label badges on which each person's name and university were neatly printed, was the paucity, and it must be said, the generally undistinguished quality of their numbers. Within a very short time, they had established that none of the stars of the profession was in residence. No one, indeed, whom it would be worth traveling 10 miles to meet, let alone the hundreds that many had covered. But they were stuck with each other for 3 days, 3 meals a day, 3 bar sessions a day, a coach outing and a theater visit, long hours of compulsory sociability, not to mention the 7 papers that would be delivered, followed by questions and discussion. Long before it was all over, they would have sickened of each other's company, exhausted all topics of conversation, used up all congenial seating arrangements at table, and succumbed to the familiar conference syndrome of bad breath, coated tongue, and persistent headache that came from smoking, drinking, and talking 5 times as much as normal. The foreknowledge of the boredom and distemper to which they had condemned themselves lay like a cold, oppressive weight on their bowels, which would soon be out of order before long, even as they thought to disguise it with bright chatter and hearty bonhomie, shaking hands and clapping back, gulping down their sherry like medicine. Here and there, people could be seen furtively totting up the names on the conference list. 57, including the non-resident home team, was a very disappointing turnout. So Perce McGarrigle was assured at the sherry party by a melancholy-looking elderly man sipping a glass of orange juice into which his spectacles threatened to slide at any moment. The name on his lapel badge was Dr. Rupert Sutcliffe, and the color of the badge was yellow, indicating that he was a member of the host department. Is that right, Perce said? I don't know what to expect. It's the very first conference I've ever been to. UTE conferences vary a lot. It all depends on where it's held. At Oxford or Cambridge, you would expect at least 150. I told Swallow nobody would come to Rummage, but he wouldn't listen. Swallow? Our head of department. This is the Phil Swallow from the first book. Dr. Sutcliffe seemed to have had some difficulty in forcing these words between his teeth. He claimed that it would put Rummage on the map if we offered to host the conference. Delusions of grandeur, I'm afraid. Was it Professor Swallow who was giving out the little badges? No, that's Bob Busby. He's just as bad, worse, if anything. Been beside himself with excitement for weeks, organizing outings and so forth. I should think we'll lose a pretty penny on this affair. Dr. Sutcliffe concluded with evident satisfaction, looking over his glasses at the half-filled room. Hello, Rupert, old man. A bit thin on the ground, aren't we? A man of about 40, dressed in a bright blue suit, hit Sutcliffe vigorously between the shoulder blades as he pronounced these words, causing the latter's spectacles to fly off the end of his nose. Perce caught them neatly and returned them to their owner. Oh, it's you, Dempsey, said Sutcliffe, turning to face his assailant. Only 57 on the list, and a lot of them haven't turned up by the look of it, said the newcomer, whose lapel badge identified him as Professor Robin Dempsey from one of those new universities in the north of England. He was a broad-shouldered, thick-set man with a heavy jaw that jutted aggressively. But his eyes, small and set too close together, seemed to belong to some other person, more anxious and vulnerable, trapped inside the masterful physique. Rupert Sutcliffe did not seem overjoyed to see Professor Dempsey or disposed to share with him his own pessimism about the conference. I dare say a lot of people have been held up by the snow, he said coldly. Shocking weather for April. Excuse me, I see Busby waving urgently. I expect the potato crisps have run out or some such crisis. He shuffled off. God, said Dempsey, looking around the room, what a shower. Why did I come? The question sounded rhetorical, but Dempsey proceeded to answer it at some length and without apparently pausing for breath. I'll tell you why. I came because I have family here. It seemed like a good excuse to see them. My children, actually. I'm divorced, you see. I used to work here in this department. Believe it or not, Christ, what a retarded lot they were. Still are, by the look of it. The same old faces. Nobody ever seems to move. Old Sutcliffe, for example, been here 40 years, man and boy. Naturally, I got out as soon as I could. No place for an ambitious man. The last straw was when they gave me a senior lectureship to Philip Swallow instead of me, although I had 3 books out by then, and he published practically nothing. Now, you wouldn't credit it. They've gone and given him the chair here, and he's still published practically nothing. There's supposed to be a book about Hazlitt. Hazlitt, I asked you, it was announced last year, but I've never seen a single review of it. Can't be much good. Well, anyway, as soon as they gave Swallow the senior lectureship, I said to Janet, right, that's it. We're off. Put the house up for sale. We're going to Darlington. They've been wooing me for some time. A readership straight away, and a free hand to develop my special interests, linguistics and stylistics. They always hated that sort of thing here, blocked me at every turn, talked to students behind my back, persuaded them to drop my courses. I was glad to shake the dust of rummage off my feet, I can tell you. That was 10 years ago. Darlington was small in those days, still is, I suppose, but it was a challenge. And the students are quite good. You'd be surprised. Anyway, I was happy enough. But unfortunately, Janet didn't like it, took against the place as soon as she saw it. Well, the campus is a bit bleak in winter, outside the town, you know, on the edge of the moors, and mostly prefabricated huts in those days. It's better now. We've gotten rid of the sheep, and our metallurgy building won a prize recently. But at the time, well, anyway, we couldn't sell the house here. There was a freeze on mortgages. So Janet decided to stay on and rummage for a while. We thought it would be better for the kids anyway. Desmond was in his last year at junior school, so I commuted, came home every weekend, well, nearly every weekend, and then I met this girl, a postgraduate student of mine. Well, you can appreciate that. I was pretty lonely up there, and it was inevitable when you come to think of it. And I said to Janet, it was inevitable. She found out about the girl, you see. He broke off, frowning into his sherry glass. I don't know why I'm telling you all this, he said, shooting a slightly resentful look at Perce, who had been puzzled on the same score for several minutes. I don't even know who you are. He bent forward to read Perce's lapel badge. University College Limerick, eh? With a leer. There was a young lecturer from Limerick. I suppose everyone says that to you. Yuck, yuck, yuck. Nearly everyone, Perce. Damn it. Nearly everyone, Perce admitted, but you know, they very seldom get further than the first line. There aren't many rhymes to Limerick. What about dip his wick, said Dempsey after a moment's reflection. That should have possibilities. What does it mean? Dempsey looked surprised. Well, it means, you know, having it off, screwing. Perce blushed. The meter's all wrong, he said. Limerick is a dactyl. Oh, what's dip his wick then? Well, I'd say it's a catalytic crochet. Would you indeed? Interested in prosody, are you? Yes, I suppose I am. I bet you write poetry yourself, don't you? Well, yes, I do. I thought so. You have that look about you. There's no money in it, you know. So I've discovered, said Perce. Did you marry the girl then? What? The postgraduate student. Did you marry her? Oh, no. No, she went her way, just like they all do eventually. Dempsey swilled the dregs of his sherry at the bottom of his glass. And your wife won't have you back? Can't, can she? She's got another bloke now. I'm very sorry, said Perce. No, I don't let it get me down, said Dempsey unconvincingly. I don't regret the move. It's a good place, Darlington. They've just bought a new computer, especially for me. And you're a professor now, said Perce respectfully. Yes, I'm a professor now, Dempsey agreed, his face darkened as he added, so is Swallow, of course. Which one is Professor Swallow? Perce inquired, looking around the room. He's here somewhere, Dempsey rather unwillingly scanned the sherry drinkers in search of Philip Swallow. At that moment, the knots of chatting conferees seemed to loosen and part, as if by some magical impulsion, opening up an avenue between Perce and the doorway. There, hesitating on the threshold, was the most beautiful girl he had ever seen in his life. She was tall and graceful, with a full, womanly figure and a dark, creamy complexion. Black hair fell in shining waves to her shoulders, and black was the color of her simple woolen dress scooped out low across her bosom. She took a few paces forward into the room and accepted a glass of sherry from the tray offered to her by a passing waitress. Did not drink it once, but held the glass up to her face as if it were a flower. Her right hand held the stem of the glass between index finger and thumb. Her left passed horizontally across her waist, supporting her right elbow. Over the rim of the glass, she looked with eyes dark as peat pools straight into Percy's own, and seemed to smile faintly in greeting. She raised the glass to her lips, which were red and moist, the underlip slightly swollen as though it had been stung. She drank, and he saw the muscles in her throat move and slide under the skin as she swallowed. Heavenly God, Percy breathed, pointing again, this time from a portrait of the artist as a young man. Then, to his extreme annoyance, a tall, slim, distinguished-looking man of middle age with a rather dashing silver-gray beard and a good deal of wavy hair of the same hue around the back and sides of his head, but not much on top, darted forward to greet the girl, blocking Percy's view of her. "There's Swallow," said Dempsey. "What?" said Percy, coming slowly out of his trance. Swallow was the man chatting up that rather dishy girl who just came in, the one in the black dress. Or should I say half out of it? Swallow seems to be getting an eyeful, doesn't he? Percy flushed and stiffened with a chivalrous urge to protect the girl from insult. Professor Swallow, leaning forward to scrutinize her lapel badge, did indeed seem to be peering rudely down her décolletage. "Fine pair of knockers there, wouldn't you say?" Dempsey remarked. Percy turned on him fiercely. "Knockers? Knockers? Why in the name would we call them that?" Dempsey backed away slightly. "Steady on. What would you call them then?" I would call them twin domes of her body's temple," said Percy. "Christ, you really are a poet, aren't you? Look, excuse me, I think I'll grab another sherry while there's still time." And Dempsey shouldered his way to the nearest waitress, leaving Percy alone. But not alone. Miraculously, the girl had materialized at his elbow. "Hello, what's your name?" she said, peering at his lapel. "I can't read these little badges without my glasses." Her voice was strong, but melodious, slightly American in accent, but with a trace of something else he could not identify. "Percy McGarrigle from Limerick," he eagerly replied. "Perce? Is that short for Percival?" "Could be," said Perce, "if you like." The girl laughed, revealing teeth that were perfectly even and perfectly white. "What do you mean, if I like?" "It's a variant of Pierce." He spelled it out for her. Pearce. "Oh, like in Finnegan's Wake, the Ballad of Perce O'Reilly." "Exactly so." Perce, Pierce, Pierce. I wouldn't be surprised if they're not all related to Percival. "Percival per se, as Joyce might have said," he added, and was rewarded with another dazzling smile. "What about McGarrigle? It's an old Irish name that means son of super valor." "That must take a lot of living up to." "I do my best," said Perce. "And your own name?" He inclined his head towards the magnificent bosom, appreciating now why Professor Swallow would appear to be almost nuzzling it in his attempt to read the badge pin there, for the name was not boldly printed like everyone else's, but written in a minute italic script. A. L. Pabst, it austerely stated. There was no indication of which university she belonged to. "Angelica," she volunteered. "Angelica," Percy exhaled rather than pronounce the syllables. "That's a beautiful name." "Pabst is a bit of a letdown, though, isn't it? Not in the same class as son of super valor. Would it be a German name?" I suppose it was originally, though Daddy is Dutch." "You don't look German or Dutch." "No," she smiled. "What do I look then?" "You look Irish. You remind me of the women in the southwest of Ireland whose ancestors intermarried with the sailors of the Spanish Armada that was shipwrecked on the coast of Munster in the great storm of 1588. They have just your kind of looks." "What a romantic idea. It could be true, too. I have no idea where it came from originally. How's that?" "I'm an adopted child." "What does the L stand for?" "A rather silly name. I'd rather not tell you." "Then why draw attention to it? If you use initials in the academic world, people think you're a man and take you more seriously." "No one would mistake you for a man," Angelica Perce said sincerely. "I mean in correspondence or publications." "Have you published much?" "No, not a lot. Well, nothing yet. I actually am still working on my PhD. "What do you say you teach at Limerick? Is it a big department?" "Not very big," said Perce. "As a matter of fact, there's only three of us. It's basically an agricultural college. We've only recently started offering a general arts degree." "Do you mean to say that you don't know who your real parents were?" No idea at all. I was a foundling. And where were you found, if that isn't an impertinent question? It is a little intimate, considering we only just met, said Angelica, but never mind. I was found in the toilet of a KLM Stratocruiser flying from New York to Amsterdam. I was 6 weeks old. Nobody knows how I got there. Did Mr. Pabst find you? No, Daddy was an executive of KLM at the time. He and Mummy adopted me as they had no children of their own. Have you really only 3 members of staff in your department? Yes. There's Professor McCready. He's Old English. And Dr. Quinlan, Middle English. I'm Modern English. The what? All of it from Shakespeare to T.S. Eliot. I did my MA thesis on Shakespeare's influence on T.S. Eliot. You must be worked to death. Well, we don't have a great number of students, to tell you the truth. Not many people know we exist. Professor McCready believes in keeping a low profile. And yourself, Angelica, where do you teach? I haven't got a proper job at the moment. Angelica frowned and began to look at her about her a trifle distractedly, as if in search of employment, so that Peirce missed the crucial word in her next sentence. I did some part-time teaching at, she said, but now I'm trying to finish my doctoral dissertation. What is it on? Peirce asked. Angelica turned her peaked dark eyes upon him. Romance, she said. At that moment, a gong sounded to announce dinner, and there was a great general surge towards the exit, in the course of which Peirce got separated from Angelica. To his chagrin, he found himself obliged to sit between two medievalists, one from Oxford and one from Aberystwyth, who, leaning back at dangerous angles on their chairs, conducted an animated discussion about Chaucerian metrics behind his back, while he bent forward over his roast shoe leather and cast longing looks up to the other end of the table, where Philip Swallow and Robin Dempsey were vying to entertain Angelica Pabst. If you're looking for the gravy, young man, it's right under your nose. This observation came from an elderly lady sitting opposite Peirce. Although her tone was sharp, her face was friendly, and she allowed herself a smile of complicity when Peirce expressed his opinion that the beef was well beyond the help of gravy. She wore a black silk dress of antique design, and her white hair was neatly retained in a snood decorated with tiny beads of jet. Her name badge identified her as Miss Sybil Maiden of Girton College, Cambridge. Retired many years ago, she explained, but I still attend these conferences whenever I can. It helps to keep me young. Peirce inquired about her scholarly interests. I suppose you would call me a folklorist, she said. I was a pupil of Jessie Weston's. What's your own line of research? I did my master's thesis on Shakespeare and T.S. Eliot. Then you are no doubt familiar with Miss Weston's book From Ritual to Romance, on which Mr. Eliot drew for much of the imagery and allusion in The Wasteland. Indeed I am, said Peirce. She argued, Miss Maiden continued, but not at all deterred by this answer, that the quest for the Holy Grail associated with the Arthurian Knights was only superficially a Christian legend, and that its true meaning was to be sought in pagan fertility ritual. If Mr. Eliot had taken her discoveries to heart, we might have been spared the maudlin religiosity of his later poetry. Well, said Peirce placatingly, I suppose everyone is looking for his own grail. For Eliot, it was religious faith, but for another, it might be fame, or the love of a good woman. Would you mind passing the gravy, said the Oxford medievalist. Peirce obliged. It all comes down to sex in the end, Miss Maiden declared firmly, the life force endlessly renewing itself. She fixed the gravy boat in the Oxford medievalist's hand with a beady eye. The Grail cup, for instance, is a female symbol of great antiquity and universal occurrence. The Oxford medievalist seemed to have second thoughts about helping himself to gravy. And the Grail spear, supposedly the one that pierced the side of Christ, is obviously phallic. The Wasteland is really all about Eliot's fears of impotence and sterility. I've heard that theory before, said Peirce, but I feel it's too simple. I quite agree, said the Oxford medievalist. This business of phallic symbolism is a lot of rot. He stabbed the air with his knife to emphasize the point. Preoccupied with this discussion, Peirce failed to observe when Angelica left the dining room. He looked for her in the bar, but just not to be found there or anywhere else that evening. Peirce went to bed early and tossed restlessly on his narrow, lumpy mattress, listening to the plumbing whining in the walls, footfalls in the corridor outside his room, and the sounds of doors slamming and engines starting in the car park beneath his window. Once he thought he heard the voice of Angelica calling, "Good night," but by the time he got to the window, there was nothing to be seen except the fading embers of the departing car's rear lights. Before he got into bed, he switched on the lamp above his sink and stared critically at his reflection in the mirror. He saw a white, round, freckled face, snub-nosed, pale blue eyes, and a mop of red curly hair. I wouldn't say you were handsome exactly, he murmured, but I've seen uglier mugs. Angelica was not present at the first formal session of the conference the next morning, which was one reason why Peirce muttered, April is the cruelest month, under his breath as they sat in the lecture room. Other reasons included the continuing cold, damp weather, which had not been anticipated by the Rummage heating engineers, the inedibility of the bacon and tomatoes served at breakfast that morning, and the tedium of the paper to which he was listening. It was given by the Oxford medievalist and was on the subject of Chaucerian metrics. He had heard the substance of it already last night at dinner and did not improve on reacquaintance. Peirce yawned and shifted his weight from one buttock to another in his seat at the back of the lecture room. He could not see the faces of many of his colleagues, but as far as could be judged from their postures, most of them were as disengaged from the discourse as himself. Some were leaning back as far as their seats allowed, staring vacantly at the ceiling. Others were slumped forward onto the desks that separated each row, resting their chins on folded arms. And others, again, were sprawled sideways over 2 or 3 seats with their legs crossed and arms dangling limply to the floor. In the third row, a man was surreptitiously doing the Times crossword, and at least 3 people appeared to be asleep. Someone, a student presumably, had carved into the surface of the desk at which Peirce sat, cutting deep into the wood with the force of a man driven to the limits of endurance, the word boring. Another had scratched the message, Swallow is a wanker. Peirce saw no reason to dissent from either of these judgments. Suddenly, though, there were signs of animation in the audience. The speaker was commencing his peroration and had made reference to something called structuralism. Of course, to our friends across the channel, he said, with a slight curl of his lip, everything I have been saying will seem vanity and illusion. To the structuralist, meter, like language itself, is merely a system of differences. The idea that there might be anything inherently expressive or mimetic in patterns of stress would be anathema. Some, probably the majority of the audience, smiled and nodded and nudged each other. Others frowned, bit their lips, and began making rapid notes. The questions session, chaired by the Alberswith medievalist, was lively. There followed a break for coffee, which was served in a small common room not far away. Peirce was delighted to find Angelica already ensconced there, fetchingly dressed in a roll-neck jumper, tweed skirt, and high leather boots. Her cheeks had a healthy glow. She had been for a walk. I slept through breakfast, she explained, and I was too late for the lecture. You didn't miss much, said Peirce. Both were indigestible. What happened to you last night? I looked all over for you. Oh, Professor Swallow asked some people back to his house for a drink. You're a friend of his, then, are you? Well, no, not really. I've never met him before, if that's what you mean, but he is very friendly, said Peirce. What was the paper about this morning? Angelica asked. It was supposed to be a Chaucer's meter, but the discussion was mostly about structuralism. Angelica looked annoyed. Oh, what a nuisance that I missed it. I'm very interested in structuralism. What is it exactly? Angelica laughed. No, I'm serious, said Peirce. What is structuralism? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Angelica looked puzzled and wary of having her leg pulled. Well, but you must know something about it, Peirce. You must have heard of it, even in, where did you do your graduate work? University College Dublin. But I wasn't there much of the time. I had TB, tuberculosis, you see. They were very decent about it. Let me work on my dissertation in the sanatorium. I had a visit from my supervisor occasionally, but mostly I worked on my own. Then before that, I did my BA at Galway. We never heard about anything. We never heard anything about structuralism there. Then after I got my master's degree, I went home to work on the farm for 2 years. My people are farmers in County Mayo. You mean to be a farmer yourself? No, it was to get my strength back after the TB. The doctor said an open-air life was the thing. And did you get your strength back? Oh, yes, I'm sound as a bell now. He struck himself vigorously on the chest. Then I got the job at Limerick. You were lucky. Jobs are hard to find these days. I was lucky, Peirce agreed. Indeed, I was. I found out afterwards I was called to the interview by mistake. They really meant to interview some other fellow called McGarrigle, some high-flying prize scholar from Trinity. But the letter was addressed to me. Someone slipped up in the registry, and they were too embarrassed to retract the invitation. Well, you made the most of the lucky break, said Angelica. They could have pointed one of the other candidates. Well, that was another piece of luck, said Peirce. There were no other candidates, not called for interview anyway. They were quite sure they wanted to appoint this McGarrigle fellow, and they were after saving train fares. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is I've never been in what you might call the swim, intellectually speaking. That's why I've come to this conference, to improve myself, to find out what's going on in the great world of ideas. You know, who's in, who's out, and all that. So tell me about structuralism. Angelica took a deep breath, then expelled it abruptly. It's hard to know where to start, she said. A bell sounded to summon them back to the lecture room. Saved by the bell, she laughed. Later then, Peirce urged. I'll see what I can do, said Angelica. As the conferees shuffled back towards the lecture room for the second paper of the morning, they cast wistful glances over their shoulders at the figure of the Oxford medievalist shaking hands with Philip Swallow. He had his overcoat on and his briefcase in his hand. That's the trouble with these conferences, Peirce heard someone say. The chief speakers tend to bugger off as soon as they've done their party piece. Makes you feel like a besieged army when the general flies out in a helicopter. Are you coming, Peirce? Angelica inquired. Peirce looked at his program. Animal imagery in Dryden's heroic tragedies, he read aloud. It could be interesting, Angelica said earnestly. I think I'll sit this one out. I think I'll write a poem instead. Oh, you write poetry? What kind? Short poems, said Peirce. Very short poems. Like haikus? Shorter than that sometimes. Goodness, what are you going to write about? You can read it when it's finished. All right, I'll look forward to that. I better go. A vaguely smiling Philip Swallow hovered nearby like a sheepdog rounding up strays. I'll see you in the bar before lunch then, said Peirce. He made a show of hurrying to the gents, intending to loiter there until the lecture on Dryden had begun. To his consternation, however, Philip Swallow, accompanied by Bob Busby, followed him. Peirce locked himself in a closet and sat down on the toilet seat. The two men seemed to be talking about a missing speaker as they stood at the urinal. When did he phone? Philip Swallow was saying, and Busby replied, about 2 hours ago. He said he'd do his best to get here by this afternoon. I told him to spare no expense. Did you? Said Swallow. I'm not sure what that was entirely wise, Bob. Peirce heard the spurt of tap water at the sinks, the rattle of the towel dispenser, and the banging of the door as the two men left. After a minute or two, he emerged from hiding and quickly approached the lecture room. He peered through the little observation window in the door. He could see Angelica in profile, sitting alone in the front row, gracefully alert, a stainless steel ball pen poised in one hand, ready to take notes. She was wearing spectacles with heavy black frames, which made her look formidably efficient, like a high-powered secretary. The rest of the audience was reporting the same tableau of petrified boredom as before. Peirce tiptoed away and out into the open air. He crossed the campus and took the road that led to the site of the halls of residence. The melting snow dripped from the trees and ran down the back of his neck as he walked, but he was oblivious to the discomfort. He was trying to compose a poem about Angelica Pabst. Unfortunately, some lines of W.B. Yeats kept interposing themselves between him and his muse, and the best he could do was adapt them to his own case. How can I, that girl standing there, my attention fix on Chaucer or on Dryden or structuralist poetics? As he recited the words to himself, it occurred to Peirce McGarrigle that perhaps he was in love. I'm in love, he said aloud to the dripping trees, to a white-bonneted pillar box, to a sodden mongrel lifting its hind leg against the gatepost of the hall's residence site. I'm in love, he exclaimed to a long line of depressed-looking sparrows perched on the railings that ran alongside the slushy drive. I am in love, he cried, startling a gaggle of geese beside the artificial lakes as he ran up and down, round and round in the virgin snow, leaving a trail of deep footprints behind him. Panting from this exercise, he came up to the entrance of Lucas Hall, the tall tower block in which sleeping accommodation had been provided for the conferees. Martineau Hall, in which they ate and drank, was in contrast a low cylindrical building, confirming Miss Maiden's view on the universality of sexual symbolism. A taxi was drawn up outside Lucas Hall, its engine churning, and a thick-set man with a fat cigar in his mouth and a deerstalker with the flaps down on his head was getting out. Seeing Peirce, he called, "Hi," and beckoned. Say, is this where the conference is being held? He asked in an American accent. The University Teachers of English Conference? It's the right name, but it doesn't look right. This is where we're sleeping, said Perce. The meetings are held on the main campus up the road. Ah, that figures, said the man. Okay, driver, we made it. How much? 46 pounds 80, governor, as the man appeared to say, looking at his meter. Okay, here you go, said the newcomer, stripping 10 crisp new live pound notes from thick wad and then pushing them through the cab window. The driver, catching sight of Perce, leaned out and addressed him. You don't want a cab to London by any chance? No, thank you, said Perce. I'll be on my way then. Thanks, governor. Governor? Awed by this display of wealth, Perce picked up the new arrival's suitcase, a handsome leather affair with the vestiges of many labels on it, and carried it into the lobby of Lucas Hall. Have you really and truly come all the way from London by taxi? He said. I had no choice. When I landed at Heathrow this morning, they told me that my connecting flight is canceled. Rummidge Airport is socked in by snow. They gave me a railroad ticket instead. So I take a cab to the railroad station in London, and they tell me the power lines for the trains to Rummidge are down. Great drama, the country paralyzed, Rummidge cut off from the capital, everybody enjoying every minute of it. The porters can hardly contain their joy. When I said I'd take a cab all the way, they said I was crazy, tried to talk me out of it. You'll never get through, they said. The motorways are covered in snowdrifts. There are people who've been trapped in their cars all night. So I go along to the cab rank until I find a driver with the guts to give it a whirl. And what do we find when we get here? 2 inches of melting snow. What a country. He took off his deerstalker and held it at arm's length. It was made from a hairy tweed with a bold red check on a yellowy brown background. I bought this hat at Heathrow this morning, he said. First thing I always seem to do when I arrive in England is buy myself a hat. It's a fine hat, said Perce. You like it? Remind me to give it to you when I leave. I'm traveling on to warmer climes. That's very kind of you. You're welcome. Now, where do I check in? There's a list of rooms over here, said Perce. What's your name? Morris Zapp. I'm sure I've heard that name before. I should hope so. What's yours? Perce McGarrigle from Limerick. Aren't you giving a paper this afternoon, he said. Title to be announced. Right, Percy. That's why I strained every nerve to get here. Look at the bottom of the list. There are never many Z's. Perce looked. It says here you're a non-resident. Ah, yeah, Philip Swallow said something about staying with him. How's it going, the conference? I can't really say. I've never been to a conference before, so I have no standards of comparison. Is that right, Morris Zapp regarded with curiosity? A conference virgin, huh? Where's everybody, by the way? They're at a lecture. Which you cut. Well, you've learned the first rule of conferences, kid. Never go to lectures unless you're giving one yourself, of course. Or I'm giving one, he added reflectively. I wouldn't want to discourage you from hearing my paper this afternoon. I went over it last night in the plane while the movie was showing, and I was pretty pleased with it. The movie was okay, too. What size of an audience am I likely to get? Well, there are 57 people at the conference altogether, Perce said. Professor Zapp nearly swallowed his cigar. 57? You must be joking. No, you're not joking. You mean I've traveled 6,000 miles to talk to 57 people? Of course, not everyone goes to every lecture, said Perce, as you can see. Listen, do you know how many attend the American equivalent of this conference? 10,000. There were 10,000 people at the MLA in New York last December. I don't think we have that many lecturers over here, said Perce apologetically. Oh, there must be more than 57, growled Morris Zapp. Where are they? I'll tell you where. Most of them are holed up at home, decorating their living rooms or weeding their gardens. And the few with 2 original ideas to rub together are off somewhere in conferences in warmer, more attractive places than this. He looked around the lobby of Lucas Hall at its cracked and dusty floor tiles, its walls of grimy, untreated concrete with disfavor. Is there anywhere you can get a drink in this place? The bar will be opening soon in Martineau Hall, said Perce. Lead me to it. Have you really flown all the way from America for this conference, Professor Zapp? Perce inquired as they picked their way through the slush. Not exactly. I was coming to Europe anyway. I'm on sabbatical this quarter. Philip Swallow heard I was coming over and asked me to take in his conference. So to oblige an old friend, I said I would. The bar in Martineau Hall was empty, except for the barmen who watched their approach with a kind of chrome-plated portcullis that stretched from counter to ceiling. Is this to keep you in or us out? Quipped Morris Zapp, tapping the metal. What's yours, Percy? Guinness? A pint of Guinness, barman, and a large scotch on the rocks. We're not open yet, said the man. Not until 12:30. And have something yourself. Oh, yes, sir. Thank you, sir, said the barman, cranking the portcullis with alacrity. I wouldn't say no to a pint of bitter. While he was drawing the draft Guinness, the other conferees, released from the second lecture of the morning, began to straggle in, Philip Swallow in the van. He strode up to Morris Sapp and wrung his hand. Morris, it's marvelous to see you after how many years? 10, Philip, 10 years, although I hate to admit it. But you're looking good. The beard is terrific. Was your hair always that color? Philip Swallow blushed. I think it was starting to go gray in 1969. How did you get here in the end? That'll be £1.50, sir, said the barman. By taxi, said Morris Sapp, which reminds me, you owe me £50 for the cab fare. Say, what's the matter, Philip? You've gone white. And the conference is just going into the red, said Rupert Sutcliffe with doleful satisfaction. Hello, Zapp. I don't suppose you remember me. Rupert, how could I ever forget that happy face? And here comes Bob Busby, right on cue, said Morris Sapp, a man with a less impressive beard than Philip Swallow's, cantered into the bar, a clipboard under his arm, keys and coins jingling in his pockets. Philip Swallow took him aside, and urgent whispers were exchanged. I'm afraid you've landed with me as your chairman this afternoon, Sapp, said Rupert Sutcliffe. I'm honored, Rupert. Have you decided on a title? Yeah, it's called Textuality as Striptease. Oh, said Rupert Sutcliffe. Does everybody know this young man who kindly looked after me when I arrived, said Morris Sapp to Percy McGarrigle from Limerick? Philip Swallow nodded perfunctorily at Percy and turned his attention back to the American. Morris, we must get you a lapel badge so that everyone who will know who you are. Don't worry, if they don't know already, I'll tell them. And when I said take a cab, said Bob Busby reproachfully to Morris Sapp, I meant from Heathrow to Euston, not from London to Rummidge. Never mind that now, said Philip Swallow impatiently. No use crying over spilt milk. Morris, where's your luggage? I thought you'd be more comfortable staying with us than in Hall. I think so, too, now that I've seen the Hall, said Morris Sapp. Hillary's dying to see you, said Swallow, leading him away. That should be an interesting reunion, murmured Rupert Sutcliffe, peering at the departing pair over his glasses. What? Percy responded absently. He was looking out for Angelica. Well, you see, about 10 years ago, those two were nominated for our exchange scheme with Euphoria State in America, you know. Zapp came here for 6 months, and Swallow went to Euphoric State. Rumor has it that Zapp had an affair with Hilary Swallow, and Swallow with Mrs. Zapp. You don't say so, Percy was intrigued by this story in spite of the distraction of seeing Angelica come into the bar with Robin Dempsey. He was talking to her with great animation while she wore the slightly fixed smile of someone who's being sung at in a musical comedy. Quite. What a set, as Matthew Arnold said of the Shelley Circle. Anyway, at the same time, Gordon Masters, our head of department, retired prematurely after a nervous breakdown. It was 1969, the year of the student revolution, a trying time for everybody, and Zapp was being mooted by some as his successor. One day, just as things were coming to a head, he and Hilary Swallow suddenly flew off to America together. And we really didn't know which couple to expect back, Zapp and Hilary, Philip and Hilary, Philip and Mrs. Zapp, or both Zapps. What was Mrs. Zapp's name, said Percy. I've forgotten, said Rupert Sutcliffe. Does it matter? I like to know names, said Percy. I can't follow a story without them. But anyway, we never saw her. The Swallows returned together. We gathered they were going to give the marriage another chance. Seems to have worked. Although in my opinion, Sutcliffe said darkly, the whole episode had a deplorable effect on Swallow's character. Oh? Sutcliffe nodded, but seemed disinclined to elaborate. So then they gave Philip Swallow the chair, said Percy. Not then. Oh, goodness me, no. Then we had Dalton. He came from Oxford until 3 years ago. He was killed in a car accident. Then they appointed Swallow. Some people would have preferred me, I believe, but I'm getting too old for that sort of thing. Oh, surely not, said Percy, because Rupert Sutcliffe seemed to hope he would. I'll say one thing, Sutcliffe volunteered. If they appointed me, they'd have had a head of department who stuck to his last, wasn't flying off here, there, and everywhere all the time. Travels a lot, does he, Professor Swallow? Lately, he seems to be absent more often than he's present. Percy excused himself and pushed his way through the crowd at the bar to where Angelica was waiting for Dempsey to bring her a drink. Hello, how was the lecture? He greeted her. Boring, but there was an interesting discussion of structuralism afterwards. Again? You've really got to tell me what structuralism is all about. It's a matter of urgency. Structuralism, said Dempsey, coming up with a sherry for Angelica just in time to hear Percy's plea and all too eager to show off his expertise. It all goes back to Saussure's linguistics, the arbitrariness of the signifier. Language is a system of differences with no positive terms. Give me an example, said Peirce. I can't follow an argument without an example. Well, take the words dog and cat. There's no absolute reason why the combined phonemes dog, D-O-G, should signify a quadruped that goes woof woof rather than one that goes meow. It's a purely arbitrary relationship. There's no reason why English speakers shouldn't decide that from tomorrow, D-O-G would signify cat and C-A-T dog. Wouldn't it confuse the animals, said Peirce? The animals would adjust in time, just like everyone else, said Dempsey. We know this because the same animal is signified by different acoustic images in different natural languages. For instance, dog is chien in French, Hund in German, Kana in England, in Italian, and so on. Cat is Schat, Katze, Gatto, according to what part of the common market you happen to be in. And if we're to believe language rather than our ears, English dogs go woof woof, French dogs go wah wah, German dogs go wow wow, and Italian ones go bow bow. Hello, this sounds like a game of animals. Snap, can anyone play? Said Philip Swallow. He had returned to the bar with Morris Sapp, now provided with a lapel badge. Dempsey, you remember Morris, of course. I was just explaining structuralism to this young man, said Dempsey, when greetings had been exchanged. But you never did have much time for linguistics, did you, Swallow? Can't say I did. No, I never could remember which came first, the morphemes or the phonemes. And one look at a tree diagram makes my mind go blank. Or blanker, said Dempsey with a sneer. An embarrassed silence ensued. It was broken by Angelica. Actually, she said meekly, Jakobson cites the graduation of positive, comparative, and superlative forms of the adjective as evidence for language. It's not a totally arbitrary system. For example, blank, blanker, blankest. The more phonemes, the more emphasis. The same is true of other Indo-European languages. For instance, Latin, vacuus, vacior, vacuissimus. Vacuissimus. There does seem to be some iconic correlation between sound and sense across the boundaries of natural languages. The foreman gaped at her. Who is this prodigy, said Morris Sapp. Won't somebody introduce me? Oh, I'm sorry, said Philip Swallow. Miss Pabst, Professor Zapp. Morris, please, said the American professor, extending his hand and peering at Angelica's lapel badge. Glad to meet you, Al. That was marvelous, said Peirce to Angelica. Later at lunch, the way you put that Dempsey fellow in his place. I hope it wasn't rude, said Angelica. Basically, he's right, of course. Different languages divide up the world differently. For example, this mutton we're eating. In French, there's only one word for sheep and mutton, mouton. So you can't say dead as mutton in French. You'd be saying dead as a sheep, which would be absurd. I don't know. This tastes more like dead sheep than mutton to me, said Peirce, pushing his plate aside. An overalled lady with bright yellow curls, pushing a trolley piled high with plates of half-eaten food, took it from the table. Finished, love? She said. I don't blame you. Not very nice, is it? Did you write your poem? Said Angelica. I'll read it to you tonight. You have to come to the top floor of Lucas Hall. Is that where your room is? No. Why then? You'll see. A mystery, Angelica smiled, wrinkling her nose. I like a mystery. 10 o'clock on the top floor. The moon will be up by then. Are you sure this isn't an excuse for a romantic tryst? Well, you said your research topic was romance. And you thought you'd give me some more material. Alas, I've given too much already. I've read hundreds of romances, classical romances and medieval romances, Renaissance romances and modern romances, Heliodorus and Apuleius, Chrétien de Troyes and Mallory, Ariosto and Spencer, Keats and Barbara Cartland. I don't need any more data. All I need is a theory to explain it all. Theory? Philip Swallow's ears quivered under their silvery thatch. A few places further up the table, that word brings out the Gehring in me. When I hear it, I reach for my revolver. Then you're not going to like my lecture, Philip, said Morris Sapp. In the event, not many people did like Morris Sapp's lecture, and several members of the audience walked out before he'd finished. Rupert Sutcliffe, obliged as chairman to sit facing the audience, assumed an aspect of glazed impassivity, but by imperceptible degrees, the corners of his mouth turned down at more and more acute angles, and his spectacles slid further and further down his nose as the discourse proceeded. Morris Sapp delivered it, striding up and down the platform with his notes in one hand and a fat cigar in the other. You see before you, he began, a man who once believed in the possibility of interpretation. That is, I thought the goal of reading was to establish the meaning of text. I used to be a Jane Austen man. I can say in all modesty, I was the Jane Austen man. I wrote 5 books on Jane Austen, every one of which was trying to establish what her novels meant, and naturally to prove that no one had properly understood what they meant before. Then I began a commentary on the works of Jane Austen, the aim of which was to be utterly exhaustive, to examine the novels from every conceivable angle: historical, biographical, rhetorical, mythical, structural, Freudian, Jungian, Marxist, existentialist, Christian, allegorical, ethical, phenomenological, archetypical, you name it. So that when each commentary was written, there would be nothing further to say about the novel in question. And of course, I never finished it. The project was so much utopian as self-defeating. By that, I don't mean just that if successful, it would eventually put us all out of business. I mean that it couldn't succeed because it is impossible. And it isn't possible because of the nature of language itself, in which meaning is constantly being transferred from one signifier to another and can never be absolutely possessed. To understand a language is to decode it. Language is a code, but every decoding is another encoding. And if you say something to me, I check that I've understood your message by saying it back to you in my own words. That is, different words from the ones you use. For if I repeat your own words exactly, you will doubt whether I really understood you. But if I use my words, it follows that I have changed your meaning, however slightly. And even if I word deviantly to indicate my comprehension by repeating back to you your own unaltered words, there is no guarantee that I've duplicated your meaning in my head, because I bring a different experience of language, literature, and nonverbal reality to those words. Therefore, they mean something different to me from what they mean to you. And if you think you've not understood the meaning of your message, you do not simply repeat it in the same words. You try to explain it in different words, different from the ones you used originally. But then the it is no longer the it that you started with. And for that matter, you're not the you that you started with. Time has moved on since you opened your mouth to speak. The molecules in your body have changed, and what you intended to say has been superseded by what you did say. And that has already become part of your personal history, imperfectly remembered. You know, conversations like playing tennis with a ball made of crazy putty that keeps coming back over the net in a different shape. Reading, of course, is different from conversation. It's more passive in the sense that we can't interact with the text. We can't affect the development of the text by our own words, since the text words are already given. That is what perhaps encourages the quest for interpretation. If the words are fixed once and for all on the page, may not their meaning be fixed also? Not so, because the same axiom, every decoding is another encoding, applies to literary criticism even more stringently than it does to ordinary spoken discourse. See, in ordinary spoken discourse, the endless cycle of encoding, decoding, encoding may be terminated by an action. As for instance, I say, the door is open, and you say, do you mean that you would like me to shut it? And I say, if you don't mind, and you shut the door. We may be satisfied at a certain level my meaning has been understood. But if the literary text says the door was open, I cannot ask what it means by saying that the door was open. I can only speculate about the significance of that door, opened by what agency, leading to what discovery, mystery, or goal. The tennis analogy will not do for the activity of reading. It is not a to and fro process, but an endless, tantalizing leading on, a flirtation without consummation. Or if there is consummation, it is solitary, masturbatory. Here the audience grew restive. The reader plays with himself as the text plays upon him, plays upon his curiosity, desire, as a striptease dancer plays upon her audience's curiosity and desire. Well, perhaps at 8.09% of the text, 30 pages in, I probably have read too much, but I hope this interests you, and I should stop right now because I've bored so many people to tears. Is there questions or comments? I've ended at 30 out of 69, part 1, 8.09% of the text. Yes, needs more elbow patch references. There are elbow patch references, and it is worth reading. I mean, this is the middle book, so it has perhaps some improvements on the first book, needless to say.
I just came in late, so I'm wondering what you're reading, and it's really brilliant from what I've heard so far.
Yes. Which one is it? Changing Places, the first one. Small World is the second one. This is Small World by David Lodge. It is a fun little book. It reads very quickly. It's with respect, it's for academics. It's beach reading, particularly academics in the humanities.
I don't know. For some reason, it reminds me of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I'm not
Oh,
sure
yes, it has some of those same elements. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. But then again,
Yes, I would.
one could say significant number of British texts also do that as well. Anyway, carry on.
Mhm.
Yes, question.
Oh, I was just gonna say that I was enjoying it. I did join in a little late too, but yeah, it sounds really good, and I like the expression you put into it. You're reading it nicely. Thanks.
Oh, yeah, well, if you hung around academics too much, you know what they sound like, and it's just annoying.
Yeah,
Particularly,
when do George and Martha from Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf make a cameo appearance?
oh, indeed, you could say that it is reflected in all three books.
Yeah, definitely.
It is one of my favorite plays, just simply because it replicates itself all over the place. My first teaching job had a pair, one in the poli sci department and one in the sociology department. They swapped wives. The chair of my department was afraid to get into the car with me because she was just afraid. I mean, sexually, which was weird. But anyway,
Oh,
let's see.
yes, it definitely had references to that.
It's got all that crap in it. And then of course it verges into, he's just doing little riffs on literary theory in here.
Right.
That whole riff on structuralism. I mean, I've adopted it for my own standard talk on structuralism, so I find it quite amusing. But it is actually quite correct as well. I mean, it's the most compact and efficient way of explaining it, of at least the front end of structuralism. Anyone else?
No, it was fun.
Close to the end of chapter one. Chapter one is 69 pages out of 69. Anyway, David Lodge, Small World. It is uploaded into the file section. If you want to read the whole thing, it's an ebook. I think I have a PDF of it if that's your preference. Gray box in the middle is the chat.
It reminded me a little of reading with the allusions to academia, a novel by, or maybe several novels by Coetzee, a South African writer.
Oh no, I haven't. I should be. If you have, can you put the name in the chat? I do read academic novels, but not very many. I mean, I don't read fiction very much at all. As amusing as it is, and as you can tell, I sort of that even the last time I read this book was probably 3 decades ago. I remember a lot of the book, and as you can tell, I actually sort of assimilated some of it into my own speak.
Yeah, you did a good job of reading all the dialogue and giving it some distinguished, which is often very hard to do.
Well, and the Lodge is very careful about creating that contrast, which he does in the first book, in the first book, Small World, because he really drives home that contrast between, doing an academic sabbatical in California as opposed to England, Midlands. So,
What year was this?
I'm
looking at, I've downloaded
1976, I think 1976.
All right. So, right, when he talked about they gave me a computer, then that was a big, 1979. Right. So having a computer was a big deal.
It was a big deal.
Yeah. No.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes, 1977, the head of the computing center was aghast at the fact that I brought in 4 boxes of holograph cards to do my research.
Those are the
God. I would never want my first job back again, but you never do. But, anyway, let me. I don't even know what the hell time it is. Oh well, yes, I've gone over time, and I will conclude
6:27.
the live stream. I will put in the J.M. Cutts. Yeah, right. I know the author. I just have never read his books, so and certainly I don't know how to pronounce it. I will put the a link to the Medium page, which does give all the citations in it. I have included on that page the 4 BBC episodes of the third book, Nice Work, which we've seen a couple of episodes. I tried to show it to us, and it was not very successful. Some people don't even probably remember it, but